we can't foresee the results, so the rule in the business was, whatever you know to be true, publish it, for better or for worse. And then once in a while, Jack Kennedy in the missile crisis comes along and says, if you print this, it may cause war. I'm going to do a blockade, but if I tip off Khrushchev too soon, he'll take a preemptive move, or he'll make a threat that he then has to carry out, and we may have to bomb. I don't want to bomb. And so I'm asking you to give me 24 hours. Hold up what you know.
And you did.
We went back into a meeting, and we'd been through this at the Bay of Pigs when we downplayed a story. We didn't bury it. And I remember Scotty Reston said, well, we have to do this, don't we?
We have to remind people. One of the great columnists, one of the great Washington State, he was Washington Bureau Chief.
He was the Washington Bureau Chief. He was my boss. I was covering foreign affairs. And I said, Scotty, can we really let this blockade, he says, but it's an act of war. Is he going to take this country into war without telling the public, without telling Congress or anybody else? And we know it, and we're going to hush it up. Scotty picked up the phone a second time, and Kennedy came on. I was on an extension, listening in, because I had raised this point. And Scotty said, Mr. President, you're going to take us into war, and you're going to shed blood before anybody knows about it. Kennedy said, Scotty, you have my word of honor. There will be no bloodshed until I get on the air tomorrow night and announce this blockade. And I'm asking you to give me the 24 hours. On that basis, we did.
People must be sitting at home now and saying, the problem, as you spelled it out a moment ago, doesn't sound that complicated to me. As you said, you as the journalist, I as the journalist, frequently cannot know what the consequences of publishing or broadcasting is going to be.
That's right.
On the other hand, says John Q. Public out there, the president, the police chief, the Secretary of Defense is in a much better position to know what the consequences can be. So why aren't you morally obligated to say, he knows a lot more than I do, I'd better listen to him?
They're not always better placed than we, and one of our jobs, arrogant as it sounds, is to monitor how well they're doing their job.
No, but that does sound arrogant, Max. Of course the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the President or the police chief knows more than you do.
Yes, so therefore our answer should be not we will publish no matter what you say, or we won't publish just because you say so, but we say, tell us why. Our prejudice is for publishing. You want us not to publish, give us a good reason. And when we have a good reason, we'll do so. Just as the reverse, you know, the Unabomber comes along and says, you must publish this. And do we give in to that kind of blackmail? This man says, I'm going to hurt people, I'm going to kill people, unless you publish a manifesto that goes on and on.
And again, you did.
Again, we did. And the answer was, give us a good reason. We went to the FBI, we talked to them, and they persuaded us that it might be helpful, as indeed it turned out to be helpful to the investigation. And so we had no choice, because did we want to wake up the next morning and say, when he kills somebody else, that he did that because we refused to carry his message?
So when Chief Moose gets before the microphones and says, in effect,
right,
nothing, most of the time.
Right.
And reporters start coming after him, and he gets irritated, but still says nothing. And reporters then do what reporters do, and if they can't get in the front door, they go in the back door, and they find some sergeant that they've known for 23 years, and they say, Charlie, come on, what's going on? And they find out. There clearly is a possibility that by publishing information or broadcasting information that is not quite ready yet, you endanger lives.
Absolutely.
Or at the very least, endanger an investigation that might be making some progress, but then you're tipping off the sniper at the same time that you're telling the public.
Absolutely right.
How much of a factor must that be in your consideration?
a great factor, but I don't know whether it's the chief or who else in that operation. They're not doing it right. There ought to be a place where you go very quickly. I have learned this. Is it a dumb rumor or is it a fact? And if it's a fact and you don't want me to publish it, give me a good reason. I think there's a lot to be learned from this whole episode that could improve the situation.
Max, times have changed. When you and I were growing up in this business, a lot more newspapers, but in my end of the business, there were 3 networks.
Sure.
There was no cable.
Right.
There was no satellite television. There are now, if this had happened 30, 35 years ago, there might have been 20, 30 reporters out there, and now there are hundreds, maybe on occasion even 1,000 or so.
Right.
Can you still operate the same way? Can we in our business still operate the same way today that we did back in the days when it was a relatively manageable crowd?
No, we can't. No quick back channel call to the police chief saying, what's going on? Tell me the truth and I'll be guided by what you tell me.
Because otherwise he'd have 50 calls. He'd have 100 calls.
He couldn't cope with it. But I think there is a way. I've been thinking about this, watching this whole episode. Government isn't up to it yet, and the press isn't shrewd enough yet to have suggested it. But there's a way of carving the press corps into those who are really living moment to moment. Those all-news cable things. And there's only, what, 3, 4 of them, and maybe the local stations. And they're living on razor's edge, and they insist they must fill the air every minute when the community is in an uproar.
And to them, the definition of news is what's happened in the last 5 minutes.
That is right.
Not necessarily what's the most important thing that's happened today, but what's happened.
That's terrible, and that shows, that, in my view, is bad journalism. But before we get to that, in terms of how they deal with government and with the police, there's no reason why they shouldn't be isolated and dealt with at one level. You who are time sensitive, we're going to feed you information in the time frame that you need it, but we'll deal with you separately from those who can wait an hour or two, and from those who are only publishing once every 24 hours. And if you carve up this press corps in that fashion and deal, not that you give them different information, but there is a different degree of urgency and a different degree of intercourse between press and officialdom, I think that can be done. Just as, in fact, in the old days, you know, Ted Koppel and Max Frankel went to the State Department and had their sources and had their briefings in a group of 3 or 4 or 6. And they weren't just in a mob scene with everybody else because they were deemed to be serious diplomatic reporters, as opposed to the wire services who needed something of the moment. I think there's a lot to be learned from this whole episode that could improve the situation. But as you say, there's also a lot of bad journalism going on.
Well, it's the journalism that their particular medium requires.
Does it?
If you, instead of having been executive editor of the New York Times, were the president of one of these 24/7 cable networks, they're on the air all the time.
Right.
They know full well that if they get off this story for half an hour to tell you what's happening in Iraq and North Korea, people are going to start flipping around, and they're going to go to the next 24/7 cable operation, and if they're still on the Sniper, that's where your audience has gone. And your audience is not that huge to begin with.
Sure.
So
But are they on the Sniper, even with a lot of guesswork, versus a cable network that had established itself as thoughtful and responsible, and we'll bring you up to date every 15 minutes, but we'll digest this stuff. We will not give you raw stuff out from this or that microphone.
You tell me.
Is that not possible?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think if one of the cable channels said, we're going to be very responsible, we're not going to give it to you until we know what's happening, and furthermore, we're not even going to give you what's happened in the last 5 minutes, we're only going to tell you, and we'll tell you 4 times an hour, the most important thing that's happened, they would lose a certain percentage of their audience to that other cable network that is doing it around the clock. Look at the local stations here in Washington. You're down here in Washington for the afternoon.
Yeah.
Yesterday, you could look, you know, out in our newsroom, we have 10 monitors up there. Every single one of them was on the story. Local stations, the cable networks, everyone.
But what were they on with?
They were on with a helicopter shot of that bus, of the bus in which that poor man had been shot and killed.
And a lot of guesswork over
and a lot of guesswork over what's happening, and FBI profilers or former profilers. But the fact of the matter is they are catering to what clearly their audience
And
wants.
if they had a Koppel or a Jennings, a person who has a calm demeanor and a reputation in the community for being highly responsible and well-informed, and that voice were the voice even for 45 minutes out of every hour. But it was saying, that started out with saying, we know nothing new at the moment. Here is the latest situation. 10 minutes ago, we had a press conference. It wouldn't work.
I don't think it would make any difference. But I mean, you know.
So then the million people who are there are ill-served, and a lot of damage is done to the psyche of the community because all of this noise in the background, even if only 1 million people are watching around the country.
Well, that's the question. Are they ill-served?
They're ill-served because it adds to the fever in the community. And from everything I gather, Washington is aflame with fever. And this doesn't help. Now, that's not our job. We're not, press are not psychiatrists treating the whole community. But do no harm is not a bad prescription for our business as well. Analysis, context, and not just facts, not just the mic in front of the chief.
Let's go back for a moment, Max, to the central notion of what you said. Publish. That's your first responsibility. We would say broadcast. That's our first responsibility. And I can hear the public saying, I don't quite buy that. I mean, first of all, we live in a totally different era now in which you have to assume, especially in a time of war, that Mr. Saddam Hussein is sitting in his palace and he's got CNN on, and even as they are putting it on the air, he sees it.
Yep.
There's not even a half-hour delay, so, you know, where some guy sitting here picks up the phone and says, you ought to know this. Isn't there a greater responsibility now on all of us to be aware of that technology, to take that technology into account, and to be conscious of the interaction between us and those who are listening to us?
Yes, but I don't see how we can take into account consequences that we cannot foresee.
Spell that out.
If John Kennedy said in jest after the Bay of Pigs, if we hadn't persuaded the New York Times to downplay the date of the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, if you hadn't pulled back the fact that the CIA was ready to go within 48 hours or something of that sort, I wish you'd published it. You would have saved me from a terrible disaster. Now, he didn't really mean that. He was really hoping that a new censorship code could apply to peacetime. But that jest was truth. We don't know whether when we publish something, it is going to cause damage or prevent a disaster. And the very fact that we cannot foretell puts me in the position of having to say, as an editor or a broadcaster, unless I hear a good reason that is so persuasive, as in the case of the missile crisis, where demonstrably 24 hours could possibly avoid grave and imminent damage to human life. If that's, take a hostage situation. If somebody says, do carry this message to the hostage takers, or please don't tell them we know where they are and that we're going to storm in through the back door because they'll start shooting, that's persuasive. If you get a good reason, you don't publish. But
But you realize how awkward that must sound to some of our friends out there who haven't worked in this business before. You're saying, you haven't quite said, damn the consequences, but you've said, since I don't know what the consequences will be,
Right.
I cannot hold myself or my staff to account for the consequences of what we put on the air or put in our newspaper.
Except that let him or her who knows or pretends to know the consequences and wants to persuade me not to publish, let them share with me their line of reasoning, and I will make a reasoned and responsible decision.
Our old friend Ben Bradley sometimes takes the dangerous position of saying to people, I don't publish the truth. I'm worried about the facts, because the truth, you know, if President Johnson says that Max Frankel, he's a well-known, you know, drug dealer, thief, right? It would be perfectly true to say the president today denounced Max Frankel, executive editor of the New York Times, as being a thief and a drug dealer.
Right.
Wouldn't be factually correct, though.
Right.
So what you worry about is facts. You want to get your facts straight.
No, there's another line needed under Max Frankel is a thief, according to the president. However, the president offered no evidence. That's the second sentence.
Okay.
That's our responsibility. Analysis, context, and not just facts, not just the mic in front of the chief.
So as you would summarize the responsibility of a journalist to his or her community, how would you do that?
Stop and think. Don't rush ahead, even with a demonstrable fact, until you can provide some context for it. That usually doesn't take more than a few minutes, but raw information is what in my day was the raw notebook, the little jottings, and to broadcast those jottings without quickly providing a sense of balance and context and circumstance, as indeed you do every night, that's irresponsible.
Context.
Context.
Facts, if you can get them.
With analysis.
And consequences never play a role unless one of these authority figures can spell out to you that the consequences would be so devastating that they override the public's right to know.
The burden of proof not to publish is on those who ask not to publish.
To watch up close any time of day, go to our website at abcnews.com.